Hi everybody, thank you for watching this. I just wanted to record this video so that I could paint a more accurate picture of why we are needing to use a surrogate for this pregnancy rather than myself being the one that carries our embryos. So I know I briefly mentioned it in our part 1 of my surrogacy story, but it deserves more explanation, of course, because I'm sure there's got to be somebody out there who's wondering. So I'm going to try to be as concise as I can possibly be without leaving out parts, and this will be a two-parter because I've already tried to record this a bunch of times and I cannot fit it into one video accurately. So anyway, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the IVF process because I want to do a separate video about that in case whoever clicked on this video isn't interested in it. So, okay, I have 2 children. One conceived totally normal and naturally, and the second one was the result of an IVF pregnancy. So that means that he was created in a test tube, basically, and he was one of 6 embryos. 2 of the embryos that we implanted initially ended in a miscarriage, and the second time we implanted 2, one of which got my son, who is now 21 months old. He was born in September of 2017, and we have 2 more that are frozen, ready to be used. So I had a pretty uncomplicated pregnancy. The only thing I will mention is that when you have an IVF pregnancy, most of the time you get a lot more ultrasounds throughout the pregnancy because there are some increased risks of certain complications, and so they want to do a lot of checking. Better safe than sorry. So we had a lot of ultrasounds. Through this process, they kind of discovered that I had I'm looking here because I'm looking at the baby monitor, and it seems as if my son is waking up, so I'm gonna try to be quick. But I had a cyst on my left ovary, and they decided to just deal with it at delivery because I knew I would have to have a C-section because I had a previous C-section. So we get to the end of the pregnancy, and my son was born at 39 weeks. He was 10 pounds 3 ounces, and via C-section. They removed my left ovary at the time because they were not able to just remove the cyst, which was honestly okay with me because I already had the embryos, like extra embryos, and so I just figured if they remove that ovary and the other one ends up not working, I don't really need any more eggs anyway because we have these 2, and whatever's meant to be will be at that point. So the reason I'm mentioning the left ovary being removed in regards to the story is because it means that they had me open on the table during the C-section for longer, which is important to the story. So it was a little bit longer, obviously. It was like 30 minutes longer than a regular C-section would be. They put my son on me chest to chest, or skin to skin, I'm sorry, and then they, whisked him off to do the things, and my husband went with them. And so I was left to have the left oophorectomy, which is what that's called when they remove your ovary, and obviously sew me back up from the C-section. And that seemed okay. We stayed in the hospital for 4 days and then went home, where I had a follow-up, I think 5 days after my son was born, 5 to 6 days. It was, you go back relatively quickly. Explained to them that I seemed to feel okay. I was having pain, of course, as you'd expect, nothing outrageous, and I was still having bleeding, which at that point is pretty normal. They wanted me to come back 2 weeks postpartum, I believe, and they rechecked me again, and I was still bleeding, and I'm not talking about spotting. I was still bleeding, like a extremely heavy period, maybe even more than that. Like I would wake up in the morning from laying flat, and a gush and a clot of blood. This is going to be TMI. If you don't like this kind of stuff, you're going to want to not watch this because there's a lot of this in there. So it would just be a huge clot of blood that would come out, and then all day long blood would trickle out. Every time I'd go to the bathroom, clots would come out, and so at this point though, 2 weeks out, they told me this is still normal, and I know that it can be. I know that you can bleed a lot. They told me you could bleed up to 6 weeks, which was not the case when I had my first son. I did not bleed for very long afterwards. Also worth mentioning, I was on Lovenox injections, which I was giving to myself in my stomach, and they help you to not get blood clots because I have a genetic blood clotting disorder. So I was also on aspirin at the time. So, and I was supposed to be doing these injections up to 6 weeks after the pregnancy, just to make sure as my hormones were returning to normal that I would not get a blood clot. So I was doing those nightly before bed as recommended. And so about 2.5 weeks to 3 weeks postpartum, I went in for a follow-up appointment because I was still bleeding too heavily for my comfort level. I am a nurse and I do know my own body, so it was more than I was comfortable with losing as far as blood goes. And so they did some ultrasounds over the next week and just kind of said, well, we can see a little something on the ultrasound. It could just be like a blood clot or like some clots of blood in there that just need to work their way out. It's common to bleed after pregnancy. You are on blood thinners, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay. So I just kept going back, every few days and had an ultrasound. Fast forward until about 4 weeks out, 4 weeks postpartum, still bleeding just as heavily. And the doctor's like, all right, well, I think we're gonna put you on a vasoconstrictor. And basically that's a medication that kind of constricts vaso, which is your veins or vascular, all your vessels for the most part. So it's supposed to, she said, if you are bleeding in there, if you have an open wound or any type of thing in there that's bleeding, if you have a little vein or a little vessel that's open and it's causing blood, this will constrict it and hopefully give it time to clot and you will be good to go. I'm like, all right, that sounds good to me, because she had also been throwing around the only other real alternative is to go in and do a D&C, and I knew that meant them going back into my uterus after it had just carried a 10-pound baby and had its second C-section, and I know that that's risky to be going in and out of an organ like that. That's crazy. So I didn't want that, and neither did she. So I'm now not seeing the doctor that delivered my son. I'm seeing another doctor within the same practice. We will call her Dr. K. So I'm seeing Dr. K at this point, and the one that delivered my son, we will call her Dr. D. So D for delivery. And that's just how I'm gonna protect her identity. Anyway, so Dr. K is the one that's seeing me now, and she says, let's try this medication. We're really gonna, we're gonna hope it works. I hope it does. And I'm like, yeah, me too. And I think it was a 3 to 5 day, I had to take it multiple times a day for 3 to 5 days. And then she said, we'll follow up. I'm like, all right, take the medication. And I can remember telling myself oh, I'm noticing a difference for sure. The bleeding is definitely less. And then I would wake up in the morning and the same clotting situation would happen, with the big blood clots. So I really wanted it to work. I was really optimistic, and long story short, it did not. So I went back. This is now almost 5 weeks. I think this is a day shy of 5 weeks postpartum. So my son is now almost 5 weeks old. And the doctor says, is it better? I'm like, no. She does another ultrasound and is like, ooh, we kind of see the same amount of stuff in there. It's probably a lot of blood, and it could be just congealed, and we just kind of need to, let's try antibiotics. I'm like, okay, I don't have a fever. They've been taking blood from me and testing it all this time just in case. And I have no elevated white blood cells, which would be present if I did have an infection. But she just wanted to put me on some high dose antibiotics just because we were trying everything so that we didn't have to go back into my body. So I'm on board because I'm willing to try anything. I'm so tired of having to wear pads every day. I'm tired of bleeding. You just want to move on, I want to have sex again. I want to, what I mean? All the things. So, they put me on this high dose antibiotic. I had to do a loading dose, which is where you take twice the recommended dose at one time to get it into your system. And then I remember having to take it 2 more times that evening. So it was 3 times a day. And, she said, let's just check back in a few days. I'm like, all right. So I go home, take the medication. I feel fine throughout the night. wake up in the next morning, and it's not good. I am delirious, first of all. I have no idea what's like I could not grasp like what my like where I was or like my surroundings. I was in bed obviously next to my husband, and I remember just being like I felt strange, you know, mentally, and I was so cold. I was actively shivering, and I told my husband, I'm like, can you like hold on to me? I'm so cold, you know, please. I had the blankets over me, I had the pillows over my head, and I remember being really nauseous and trying to walk to the bathroom and just like being dizzy and sitting down on the floor over the toilet on the cold floor, and I remember it feeling like I was sitting on a block of ice, and I was nauseous but couldn't like throw up, like, you know, I wasn't like sick to my stomach. I just felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. My head, I couldn't even see because my head hurt so bad. So I go back, and I'm like so out of it that I can't even make sense enough to like take my temperature. And so I like get in, you know, I get back into bed, and my husband's like, you're sweating. I'm like, okay, well, maybe we should take my temperature. At that point I do. It's like 104 point God knows what. And I'm like, you need to get me ibuprofen. I take the ibuprofen. I do have a 5-week-old baby at this point and an older child, and I need to go to the doctor, and my baby is sleeping in, you know, so I call my father-in-law because he's the only one nearby at this point. My mother-in-law, who was staying with us to help me, had already gone home. My husband is now back at work, working from home, and I need to get to the doctor. I call them, I'm like, hey, this is what's going on, you know, what should I do? And they're like, come right in right now. I'm like, fine, this is Dr. K telling me. Because the nurse like was probably really annoyed with hearing my name and hearing my voice from calling so much. She just gave the phone to her, like went out and got her from a room and gave the phone to her and was like, she's like, you need to come in right now. I'm like, okay. I tell my husband, I said, I think we're going to the hospital today. And he was like, okay, you know. I think he's sick of it at this point too. He just wants like for everybody to just move on from this. I mean, after a 9-month pregnancy and months and months and months before that having IVF, where we're just in offices all the time, it gets really old really fast. And so I go into the doctor, and she does another ultrasound and says, everything looks the same. By that time, my fever had come down because of the ibuprofen, but it was still high. It was still like 100. And I had had the ibuprofen in my system at this point for like 45 minutes. And she's like, you know, they gave me some Tylenol in the office, and she's like, you just need to go over to the hospital. There's a really good doctor on call. We're going to give you a DNC, or do a DNC, which is basically where they just go into your uterus and kind of scrape everything out. They do it after miscarriages a lot, if they just have to kind of get, you know, just clean everything out of there. And I'm like, fine. Like I'm scared at this point. I am scared because I know that I have antibiotics in my body and that I should not have a fever this high. And I've never had a fever this high. And I know this sounds really dramatic, but I can only imagine the way that I felt with that fever is the way that people feel right before they have a seizure, because I did not feel in control of like my cognitive function or like moving, like I being so dizzy and not being able to like think clearly. Like I remember just feeling like I'm not like something is about to burst or something. Like I felt so out of control and so like uncomfortable at that time. So it was really, at that time I was spooked. I was like super spooked. And so we go to the hospital. He, you know, my father-in-law takes me to the hospital. It's a mess. No one knows why I'm there. They like didn't call to like let them know that I was coming for an emergency DNC. And finally, after like all the triaging and like checking in, they moved my room like 3 times. Each time they like put me in a gown, like got me naked, you know, and like I had to get redressed and moved. And so I also was filling up with breast milk at this point, and like nobody could find a breast pump and I was at a women's hospital. So that was kind of frustrating. I'm just venting at this point for no reason, but I finally talked to the doctor, the one that they say is so good, who's going to do the DNC, and I've never met her before, and she says, I know that you're on blood thinners, the shots. I'm really worried about doing the DNC while it's within your system, you know, within 24 hours in your system. I want to put you in the hospital overnight, pump you full of antibiotics. What did she call me? Or what did she call it? She said like, I want to like load you up or something. And it's like a triple, like 3 different types of antibiotics. And it kind of just encompasses all of it. They wanted to pump me full of that, do the DNC the next morning. I'm like, sounds good to me, you know, like whatever you say, let's just do this. Give me a breast pump, you know, I'm like at this point. And because I couldn't have any visitors back where I was. And so like my husband I just told him to stay home because I knew nobody could come see me, you know, like don't worry about bringing the baby. So, and I'm not super big fan of having my newborn in a hospital unless he needs to be there, you know? So anyway, they put me in a room, and let me tell you, that night was the worst night of my life. I kept, like, they had me on Tylenol, like through an IV, and they couldn't get my fever down. Like it was crazy. I kept just shivering, and they took all my clothes and they cranked the room all the way down to freezing. They had a cold cloth in my head, and I am just uncontrollably shivering, and like my muscles hurt from just like, you know, shivering. And they couldn't really give me much else other than Tylenol because I had to have surgery the next day, and anything else will thin your blood too much. Not surgery, I keep saying that, a procedure. And that was like, they didn't want that, obviously. So they eventually did have to give me Motrin, and then in the middle of like having the antibiotics, them giving me Motrin, they take blood cultures, which isn't like taking blood, like having blood taken, like, you know, for blood work. They took blood cultures, so they put them in like a petri dish, and then they like see what will grow on it. And I know that that means that they're checking for sepsis, which was horrifying to me, because I know that that's a serious, like I've met people who have passed away from sepsis. I've seen people die from sepsis, and I've had family members die from sepsis. And I said, they're not checking, and here I am like fevered out. I'm like, they're not checking me for, they don't think I'm septic, do they? And I wasn't thinking clear enough to know that not having elevated white blood cells, but having a fever, like that's all it could really be. Like it would have to be sepsis for this to make any sense. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the story right here. And I'm sorry that I have to leave you hanging, but somebody has woken up, and stay tuned for part 2 of this. And I will also be updating on the surrogacy thing very soon, as soon as I get a little bit more juicy information for you guys. Thank you for watching up until this point. I'm sorry if this was all over the place. Have a great day. Thanks.